It's live. Good morning. So we'll call this Atzilus Part 3, the anatomy of its structure. And specifically, I'm going to discuss the process of how a Sefirah evolves in the language of Kabbalah and Chassidus. It consists of 3 stages, which is called Neukdah, Sefirah, Partzuf. So that will be the theme of this shir. Now, this is following the previous shiurim I gave on discussing firstly Atzilus as tikkun of Tohu, discussed that at length, and then the very nature of Atzilus itself as elam of ha'achdus and elikus, iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'garmu echad, as the primary model of what is a perfect structure, a perfect existence. So we can try to live up to that. So we have the standard. And so I want to go now into, in that order, so what does Atzilus consist of? So even though the Sefirahs don't begin in Atzilus, as I'll talk about shortly, but in Atzilus they become full-bodied. So if we're using an example that Atzilus is like a newborn child, whereas Akudim, for instance, would just be the conception of one cell, Eser Eres Okud B'Klei Echad, so everything is concentrated in one seed, and Tohu is already Nekudim broken down into 10 Eres and 10 energies and 10 containers, but it's not yet a structure that is viable. And Atzilus, called Tikkun, everything is Biskalus, as we discussed. Not just that there's a structure, but the structure works well together. So in Tohu you could say there's a structure, but the structure ultimately collapses. That's called Sefirah Sakelim, shattering. And Nakudim, you can't say there's a structure yet. You could say there's a Nakudim. But in Atzilus, it's a full-blown structure, meaning there's 10 Sefirahs, and Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'garmu echad. So indeed, the Sefirahs are structured. They are also, of course, saturated with godliness. It's chesed of elikus, and gvura of elikus, and chochma, and bina, and das, and all of them is chochmos yisbarach. But it is in the form of the structure, and as I mentioned, it's all elikus. In Aved, it's like the oves hein amarkava, or any neshama of Atzilus that's completely aligned. They exist. Avram was a full-bodied human being, but his whole being was kulei merkava, 24/7. The whole thing was just a channel for godliness in this world, of chesed specifically. Same thing with Yitzchak and Yaakov and so on. And as far as the word elam ha'achdus, I don't know if I emphasized it that strongly. I'll just say a few lines about that. Obviously, it goes hand in hand. Achdus and elikus is really synonymous. When there's elikus, things are united. When there's pirud, when there's no elikus, there's pirud, there's separation, and vice versa. Achdus is ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu motze what's the lashon? Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu motze the end of Shas. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu motze klei machzik shalom el hashalom, klei machzik bracha el hashalom. So shalom is Achdus, skalulus, and that's the ultimate place where kedusha and elikus resides. So Atzilus, I think I did describe Atzilus like the vision of entire existence, the way the Eibishter wants it to be, but not like the vision in Ak, which is not yet even a structure. It's more a vision of Ak, is more machshava gduma da Ak, like skira achas, like more of a bird's eye view. Atzilus is a full structure, but it's completely Achdus because everything, Ches, Chachma, through Malchus, are all united only toward one thing, which is Kvedei Shel Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's in Bri, Yitzir Asiyah, after the Parsa, which we'll discuss in later shiurim, where it starts taking on a yesh b'fnei atzmei, and it's not completely aligned with exactly the kavon el yena in the purest form. Obviously, when it comes down to elam haza, tachten shein tachten lematim, and then it's a whole other world of cheshach kafel mechupel, and it's actually it goes to the point of aniva afsied, even against defying Ratzon Hashem. But we're not there yet. So in that context, so what we want to talk about is what exactly is the structure of Atzilus look like. So we know there's Sefirah. The lashon of the Sefirah Yetzirah, Sefirah blima, and Eser v'lei Tesha, the Eser v'lei Achadasar. So 10 Sefirahs is the structure. We discussed at length that the Sefirahs really is God's instruments, which is not necessarily a perfect word because not all the shittas hold it's like an instrument, but you can think of God's so-called tools and instruments to create existence. So just like we say, Basara Mamoris Nivra Elam, Dafka Sara, not more, not less, from Bereshis Nami Maimerhu, all the way through that Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu K'Nusenu, and in between Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rakia, and so on. So these 10 statements, Maimoris, originate from the 10 Sefirahs, and the 10 Sefirahs originate all the way, as Chassidus elaborates, Lifnei Tzimtzum, what is called the language Shir Atzmei B'Keach, when the Eibishter envisions and allocates, so to speak, the resources. Think of it like the artist or the architect. Before they even begin building, they're envisioning what they want to build. That vision, which is Lifnei Tzimtzum, actually called Atzilus the Klolos, that is Sefirahs that are completely in God's mind, so to speak. I don't know if you can use the word mind even, but it's definitely an Eid Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. Those Sefirahs are gnuzes, and they're called gnuzes simply because, like the Alter Rebbe Rashab explains in the beginning of Ayin Beis, they're completely pshitis, which means they have no shape and form. The only reason we call them Sefirahs is because the Fierech, Sefirahs Einketz, or altogether beyond Sefirahs, it has something. So the Eibishter is envisioning. Atzilus is called Sefirahs Hagluyes, not Agnuzes, because here you actually have a full, if you use the example of a child, a full-bodied structure that has all the keiches and all the faculties and all the Sefirahs at work. But nevertheless, as we've been discussing time and again, that the Eibishter did everything in a Seder Mesudar for us to be able to understand his process, as well as for us to be able to retrace the steps through our Avodah and connect. So even the development of a Sefirah doesn't just happen automatically, just like we learned Ak, Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim, Atzilus. So the same thing in the actual Sefirahs, there's also a process. And that process is what I said earlier at the outset, is generally discussed as many things, as 3 steps. So we'll talk about Neukdah, Sefirah, and Partzuf. Like everything begins always with a Neukdah. Just like Yud Kei Vav Kei, you start with a Yud. You can't do anything without a Neukdah, because without a Neukdah there's no beginning. So in Oasis, you always start when you write a Neukdah. Same thing in anything you do. Just like we spoke about Akudim in the Elamus, Akudim is also a Neukdah. It's all the Sefirahs, all the Eidus, I should say, in Klei Echad. So it's a Neukdah. So in the Sefirahs itself, it begins first, everything begins with a Neukdah, meaning Nekudus HaChochmah, Nekudus HaBina, Nekudus HaDas, Nekudus HaChesed, and so on. Das is not always included because of the Das Kesed issue, but I'm not going to discuss that right now. That we'll talk about when we talk about the Sefirahs themselves. So everything starts with a Neukdah, which again, the Eibishter doesn't need to do it that way, but it's the way everything is done. Like a seed turns into a tree, and like any process of intelligence starts with first one point, and from that point they develop and flesh it out. Or a mayon turns into a river, into a nar. So everything starts with Neukdah, and from there it goes into harchava, so to speak. So the next step is Sefirah. So Sefirah, what exactly means? What is the meaning of the word Sefirah? Well, first, before we get into the full meanings, the main meaning relevant to Neukdah is that it's not just a point, but it's a full entity. Like when you describe Chochmah, even though it starts with a point, but there's also Chochmah has a lot of aspects to it. Koyach Ma, there's the Koyach of Chochmah, there's the Ma of Chochmah, and we know even though Chochmah is like the Yud of Yud Kei Vav Kei, so itself a Neukdah, but the Yud also there's the body of the Yud, there's the Keitzei Elyon, the Keitzei Tachten. So when you dissect the Yud, you see it has details. It's true. It's not as like a hay, which is a full-blown structure, but Yud is also details. So Sefirah would mean basically not just the point of what Chesed is, but all the details of Chesed. And that makes it into the Midah called Midas HaChesed. Chesed is a good example to use because it's just easier to discuss. So Chesed, all the elements of it. And then there's the third step where it comes at Partzuf. Now, Partzuf literally means, in Hebrew, it can mean a face, a structure. A Partzuf is a combination of several Sefirahs. There's no such thing as a Partzuf without several things. It always has several points to it. When you say, let's say, human face, Partzuf Adam, so when you say face, we know a face, even in halacha, what is a face? When you have to, let's say, identify somebody, so whether it's Ad Chetmei or whatever the different days in the Gemara about how you identify, you can't identify someone just by one feature. One eye is not enough. You have to have the different components. A full face consists of a forehead, eyes, a nose, a mouth, and ears. And there's also more details, complexion, cheeks, and so on. So when you say Partzuf, you always mean a combination of Sefirahs. So how many Partzufim are there, let's say, in Atzilus? Anybody know? There's 5 Partzufim, generally speaking. One is Atik and Arich, even though it's not Atzilus Mamish, it's the Kesser of Atzilus, but it's still a Partzuf. There's the Partzuf of Chochmah, the Partzuf of Bina, and there's Midas, Zah, and Malchus. So though there's 10 Sefirahs, but Partzufim are made up of a certain combination. Sometimes you say the Partzuf of Meichin, some the Midas, but generally it's 5 Partzufim, which is not really relevant to our discussion. Just the point is, so what's Zah? When you say Zah, you see Sefirahs, and I mean, many of us learn it and we just accept it. Why is Zah identified? Why isn't it Zah Sachakol is Chesed Gura Teferes Netzach? You say that's Zah, but it's called Zoyer Ampin, small face. Anpin and Partzuf is more or less the same word. Just like Arich Anpin is a long face, meaning like a Barchova. So Zoyer Ampin is a small structure, the structure of the Midas Ha'adam, which goes from Chesed to Yesod. Malchus is not counted in that. That's why you say Zah or Yichud Zun, Zah v'Nukve, or Zah and Malchus, because Malchus is its own Partzuf. Now Malchus is a unique Sefirah, and even as a Partzuf, it's not that simple because we know Les Lo Megam Klum, doesn't have anything of its own. But when you say Binyan HaMalchus, you're basically saying you're taking Malchus, which is just a Neukdah, and you're turning it into a Partzuf, which we'll talk about when I talk about Malchus. Just wanted to distinguish that the Partzufim are not the same. So therefore, when you have a structure like our existence, let's just look at Elam Hazeh. So you don't just have a bunch of details, Eschalkus of many details, or you can say they all originate from the Asar Maimoris, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Shari Yichud Ramunah, that everything comes from those Chav Beis Esis HaTeira. So it's not just it breaks down, it also breaks down into structures. For example, you have the Elam HaDaimim, Elam HaTzameach, Elam HaChai, Elam HaMedaber. In Elam HaTzameach itself, you have flowers, you have trees, you have grasses, or the same thing with Elam HaChai. You have birds, you have fish, you have mammals. So in other words, it's not just there's a bunch of detailed different creatures, there's also Partzufim, there are also structures in existence, which of course makes total sense when you think about it. And again, everything is here made in order for us to understand it. So in other words, it's like just like we have human beings. It's not just 8 billion people on this planet, you also have families. And families have communities, and communities have different people of different races and cultures and religions and faiths and so on. So in other words, it's not just single entities, which would be like Sefirahs, but there's Partzufim. So there's structures, and those structures are made up of Sefirahs. So Neukdah Sefirah Partzuf is basically 3 steps in building a structure. One would be it starts with a Neukdah, a point. It develops into an entity like Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, or Chochmah, Bina, and then combining several Sefirahs together, you create a full structure. So you say Moichin is Chochmah, Bina, Das. So even though that may not always be called a Partzuf, but that's the idea. Zah for sure is a Partzuf. Chesed through Yesod. Even though they're very different, Chesed and Gvura are not at all the same. But when you count them all as the Midas HaAdam, that's the spectrum of the human emotions and human feelings, are based on either Chesed or Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Yesod. And they're supposed to work together. The Atzilus, which is what we have, let's say Sefirah Se'emer, is Chesed Sheba Chesed, Gvura Sheba Chesed, all the way to Malchus Sheba Malchus. Or the Mem Beis Masoyis, Chassidus explains, is 6 times 7. It's Chesed Sheba Chesed, all the way Yesod Sheba Chesed, so that's 42. 49 is Sefirah Se'emer, as I just mentioned. So these are all the structures that ultimately will create structures of existence that as we know it. So take the human body, besides our face. The face is a composite of different details, all harmonized and creating one face. We say it's one face, but it's made up of pieces. The same thing, the human body is that way. You don't say you're made up of Ramach Ivarim and Shasa Gidim, correct? But it's all part of one person, and they all work together in that way. So when you look at Atzilus, the perfect world, so to speak, you understand that the Sefirahs themselves are really a part of a process of starting from a point, developing into a full character, which would be Chesed or Gvura and the other Sefirahs, and then these characters working together, creating a Partzuf. And all of it together adds up to Elam HaAtzilus. And the word Elam really means a combination of Partzufim, which is a combination of Sefirahs, which is a combination of Nekudahs, if you really want to put it in the very technical terms. And that's how an Elam is created. Now, why is all this relevant? It's not just, scientific. It's nice if we were, like a doctor needs to understand the anatomy of a human body. You don't have to know how to dissect it. But why is it relevant? Because remember, all this is not just a nice theory. This is what makes us tick. This is how Elam Hazeh and Elam Kotten Zeh Adam is exactly structured this way. We are a combination of Nekudahs that build into Sefirahs, that build into Partzufim. In the human being, it's called Keiches HaAdam. So Keiches are Neshtalshel Mehen from the Sefirahs. But we also are made up. So number one is to come to understand who we are and how the world works. But most importantly, it's about Avedus Hashem. If the purpose of Aveda is to make a dira b'tachtenim, the whole tachlis habriya. So you need to know what tachtenim look like. Tachtenim Lashon Rabbi means it's made up of different structures and made up of different details. And we want every detail to be saturated with Kol means everything, that every detail down to every piece of daimon, Semeach Chaim Medaber, every cell and every fiber of existence should be permeated with the Kvedei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with Elokus. So the only way you can do that is by knowing these details. So you can't just say, okay, b'mamshech ha'er klali, I'll just do whatever the Eibishter wants me to do. No, the Eibishter wants b'feidish, lefikach hirbe lehem teira mitzvahs, Ratz HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'zakis hirbe lehem teira mitzvahs. As Chassidus explains, what's the zechus? Because it gives us the mitzvahs. Each mitzvah corresponds to another detail of existence. Whole Sefer Chreidim is just on this topic, explaining how each mitzvah corresponds to the Ramach Evarim, to each Ever, and to the Shasa Gidim. And there's mitzvah satluyis b'maisa, mitzvah satluyis b'dibur, mitzvah satluyis b'machshava, and the same thing with your eyes and your ears. There isn't a detail in the human being, in the human body, that doesn't have a corresponding mitzvah to it. Ramach mitzvah sesa, keneged Ramach Evarim. Ramach shasal mitzvah sesa, keneged Shasa Gidim. So the details, therefore, are critical, but at the same time, it's not just details, they're also about bringing them together into Sefirah, first a Sefirah, and then into Partzufim. So essentially, put it in simple aces, when we create Achdus in an Elam or Alma de Pruda, in an Elam of Pirud, we're essentially turning the world into Partzufim of Elokus, to use the expression from Kabbalah. You're not going to see that language very often, but that's essentially what it says in Eitz Chaim and other places. That the goal is to take the different pieces of our lives and turn them into one direction. Like when you say you turn it into a harmony or some other synchronicity, which is essentially what real Aveda is, taking fragmented pieces and directing them all, the Kvedei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whatever the shlichus that you have in this world. So that's essentially the understanding of why we need to understand the structures that I just described, the Kudus Sefirah Partzuf. Now, to drill down a bit more into what a Sefirah is. So this is Alter Rebbe's Maimorim Tzemach Tzedek elaborates, but his Ayin Beis is where he really turns it into a whole sugya in Chelik Aleph of Ayin Beis, at least Chelik Aleph, the Tfusim Harashenim that I'm familiar with. So there's a whole section in Ayin Beis that probably runs for at least 100 pages in Maimorim, beginning like basically around Perek Samach or something like that, and on, where he talks about Sefirah, gives three different meanings in the word Sefirah, and then adds a fourth. So let's talk about that, because to understand the Sefirahs, to understand what the word Sefirah means. Now, so Sefirah Se'emer, everybody knows the expression, means to count. means the counting of the Omer. You count Sheva Shabbos Tmimus, Tiyena, from the second day of Pesach, Machras HaShabbos to Shavuos. But Sefirah means more than just counting. So one meaning is mispar, number, from the word mispar, or is the noun, or lisfer, or to count. Second meaning, he says, from the word sipur, telling a story, a narrative, the sapir, like Yisapir Yitzias Mitzrayim, the sipur, story. And the third meaning in Sefirah is from the word sapir, Evan sapir, which literally means a sapphire stone. It's a brilliant stone, it's a precious stone that illuminates. For example, it says in some places that the luchas are made from sanpirin, from sapir, sapphire stone. And that's what it says from the Hishiron Mipseloshon Shaluchis of Moshe. When he broke them, they became wealthy because it wasn't just a plain stone, it was a sapphire stone. It was shining, a bright stone. So those are the three meanings. And then later, also from the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Rashab adds one more meaning, sefer. Like a book, not just a story, but an entire sefer. So also the Sefirah comes from the word sefer. So the sefer, sipur, the three things, sefer, sipur. So how does he explain these three? Actually quite beautiful and very eloquent. Why is Sefirah called this? What is the meaning, a number, and the second meaning, a story, and the third is just three different meanings. So he actually explains that it's in a progressive order. Remember, we spoke last week, previous weeks, that the whole purpose of Atzilus is begin dish tamudin bey. And Atzilus, Hashem created a world in order for us to meet him, so to speak. So we should be able to know Elokus, to understand Elokus, and he adds also to have a hergish in Elokus. So essentially, the moichin of Atzilus is in order to give us an understanding, because from that moichin is nishtalshel, evolves our moichin. So when we sit now, if we didn't have a mind that was shaped b'tzelem elikim, b'tzelem edmus of moichin of Atzilus, how would we ever be able to understand the Eibishter? We'd be able to understand each other. We'd be able to understand Nivroim and the Dvarim that are similar to us, physical things. But to understand the Eibishter, we have to have something in common. So that's the whole point where Elokus, after the Tzimtzum, was mislabish in the Sefirahs, like we discussed, the Maral and the Rambam, and the Arizal essentially is that the Eris in the Kelim, Chachma Bina Das. So now we have a place where on one hand it's Chachmasi is Baruch, in Teira. Teira is not just purely Amunah, even though you need also Amunah and Asav and Ishma, but Teira is a Chachma. You learn all day here. What are you learning? You're learning a wisdom. But it's not human wisdom, it's divine wisdom. That's the difference. So it's wisdom, meaning it relates to our seichel, and we have a mitzvah to understand Torah, Leida, to understand the Torah, to understand the Eibishter, not just to believe, not just lahaymin. How is that possible? Because there's moichin Atzilus. That's the essential explanation. Same thing, how can we have a haftas Hashem lekecha? Ulman Hashem lekecha tira, yiras Hashem. How is it possible to have Ava and Yira? Also, you need something in common. So there's a Ava and Yira, or Chesed and Gvura in Atzilus, which corresponds to Ava and Yira. So therefore, we can then relate to the Eibishter through Atzilus. So Atzilus, essentially, without it, we would have nothing in common. It would be like Kol Yochel, the Eibishter can do anything, but here we have a sensible, logical way. It's Al Derech Moshel, the teacher is coming down to the level of the student through Misholim, and through other ways that the student can relate to the teacher. He's not just teaching ideas that are completely lamaila from our kelim, lamaila from our hasoga and hageshim. So based on that principle, we can understand the meaning of the word Sefirah. If the whole purpose of Atzilus, and therefore the Atzilus of the Sefirahs, because that's what it's called, the Netzolim, sometimes it's called. The Hatzolis HaSefirahs, the Eibishter is emanating. Remember, it's not Nivroim, it's Netzal, like we learned by Yetzal Min HaRuach. It's imparting. So on one hand, it's definitely a new entity, and sometimes even called Yesh Ma'ayim, but on the other hand, it's a Hatzalah, which is like Gilei Hela. We discussed that, not going to go into the details of that. So now, in the Netzolim of Atzilus, so the Eibishter was Maitzil, so therefore the Sefirahs, what are they? They're here to be for us Both the Eibishter, so to speak, is mislabish, he manifests himself in these spheres to help us understand how he created everything and to help us to connect, like I just said, to know him, to have Yediyas Hashem and have Avos and Yiras Hashem. So if that's the case, so then the spheres themselves have to have those components. And this is how the Rebbe Rashab explains the progression of the three meanings in the word spheres. So the first meaning is, it only tells us a number. Like he explained, when you say something has a number, so you don't know much about it. If I told you there's like $100 on the table, he uses actually that example really comes from Siddur Imdach, from the Mitler Rebbe, Alter Rebbe. When you say 100, the number 100, it doesn't tell you, it could be 100 apples, it could be 100 oranges, it could be $100. But it does tell you something, that there's a certain value here. So it's like the chitzenius of whatever it is that you're talking about. So mispad is definitely a conveying a message. You want to say, people say, how much is it? Or how many are there? Like you have the mispad b'nei Yisrael, when you have the minyan b'nei Yisrael, that different times in the Torah. Why is it so negate to count them? If counting is just chitzeni, because counting tells you, is something like the Rashi says, b'shah, that b'metech v'vasan, mein nese b'chol shah. When you find something precious, you count it. So even though the very count is just only an external number, but it shows that you value it. So it does tell you about the chshivas of it, it tells you the value. So the Rebbe Shab, in explaining in Ayin Beis, I'm just giving a kitzur, he explains this on pages upon pages. So misper, sfirim, losh misper, you can say is more like, I don't want to call, he doesn't use, I think, the word chitzenius as spheres, but it definitely is the chitzenius of the spheres. So they're telling us something about Elikus, but it's more about the chshivas of Elikus, or the value, as opposed to more details. So it is the first definition of spheres. So when, for example, let's say, we just learned the Maimer Basar Legani. This year's Maimer, Perik Yud Beis, in Basar Legani, the Rebbe's explanation of Tavshin Chav Beis. So what does he say there? Marabu Masecha, Magadlu Masecha, that it gives us Ad Kadei Ein Sof. What is it all telling us? To show us how the Eibishter's infinity comes even in this world. That means by even counting the numbers, or even beyond numbers, he's giving us a Gilui of Elikus. So when you see Ma Rabu Masech or Ma Gadlu Masech, Rabu means Kamos. That there's so many multitudes of creations, both in Tzva Shamayim and Tzva Aretz. How many species are there? Millions, if not billions. And in each species and all the details, so it's not just a Chesenizdika thing, it's giving us a sense, a yediyah and a hergish in God's so-called magnitude, in his capacity to create so much infinity. So many objects to the point of Ein Sof. So Marabu Magadlu essentially is what Mispar, the word Mispar in Sefirah is teaching us. So the fact that you have 10 spheres, the 10 spheres break down to another 10 times 10, and then again 10 times 10 times 10. Like we spoke about the Mamoris, the Chav Beis Eisius, and the different combinations create everything in existence. Even Evan, which is not one of the Asar Mamoris, but the Evan is 3 letters in the word, in the Chav Beis Eisius of the Aleph Beis. So one way or another, this 22 letters, which originate from the Asar Mamoris, are all basically creating all the different details in existence. So in this context, what is Sefirah teaching us? That aspect of the power of Elikus in detail, in number and in multitude and so on. So that's step number 1. So beginning at Hizbanus, when a person is mizbein in Marabu Masecha, is mizbein in the Mispar of the Nivroim, which reflects on the Mispar of the Sefirah. That's where it's coming from. So it gives us a certain ability to know the Eibishter and also to have a hergish, because you are inspired from the power of the Eibishter to create so many details, like this intricate design of the world at which we live in. Now, how far can you go with this Hizbanus? You can go pretty far, because you can contemplate not just on the detail. I mean, you can just look at a flower and see Gadlus Habeira in it. And that alone could be a whole lifetime. And the same thing with the other Nivroim. You can study everything in detail and come away amazed about the haflas, the ployas Habeira, the haflas Habeira, the haflah of the Eibishter's creation, and therefore the haflah of the Eibishter. However, obviously, at the end of the day, it's going to be limited by the fact that it is ultimately a mispar. And therefore, it's really focused mostly on the details that we can relate to. So it's like Elikus as Mislabish and Nevroim. Then comes step 2 in Sefirah, and that is Sipur. Now Sipur, as soon as you hear the word Sipur, you tell me. Sipur is a story. A story is more than just numbers. If I was going to read to you right now a bunch of numbers, maybe you'll have interest for 5 minutes, but after that you're going to get pretty bored. If I just start reading numbers. But if I tell a story tells you it's a whole narrative. People, there's drama, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's a whole story. It's true that many people, maybe mitzvahs anoshim u'lamada, they read the Haggadah every year the same way, but that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be read every year in a new way. It's like a new experience. So a story is a whole other thing. So the Sefirah tell us the story of the Eibishter. And here the Rabbi Rashab says, it starts revealing the Sefirah, not just the Slapshus and Marabba Masecha, how the Eibishter creates existence and all the details. And there's plenty of his bonus there, as I said. But now, what is the story behind that? What is the meaning of it? Like, why did he create it? You can look at a piece of art, for example, and be fascinated by it and be an analyst. There are analysts of art, they can analyze art forever. But what's the story behind the art? Why did the artist create this art? And what mood was he in when he did it? I'm talking on a human level. And what else does it reveal to us? So Sipur is already much more revealing than Mispar. You say the number of something, yes, it tells you something about it. The chshiva is the value, as he explains. There, Sumarim Enechum Rumi Bara Ela is more like Mispar, Marabu. And Sipur, however, is far more telling us what is the story behind it. Now, in a story itself, there's also levels. You read a story, whatever story it is, whether it's the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim or any story in life, so you can read it also. At one level, you hear the main story, but then those that have a deeper understanding can learn much behind the story, what was behind the scenes. Like take the story of Yutas Kislev. Alter Rebbe was arrested, and then he was freed, and so on. So we know the story is much more than just the arrest and the liberation. It's a story in heaven. A story that there was a kitrug or a kpeda l'mayla, and the Alter Rebbe being Megalach Chassidus, and the Geula of Yutas Kislev was a sense of redemption where the Gzeira was off. So that's already a deeper story. The story of Purim. You read it ostensibly, it's a story, but then there's the hand of Hashem that's behind the story, etc., etc. So Sefirah in that context, when you say Sefirah from the word Sipur, or Lesapis, it's telling us the story of the Eibishter, but it's still, even the highest point of it, it's still what he calls in Ayin Beis. It's not just the so we're not just talking about the slapshus of Eris and Kalim. It's telling us the story of the Eir, not just as it is in Kalim. Eris and Kalim would be Mispar. The Eir itself would be more the story behind it. So when you learn about the Eir, you're learning more about the Eibishter, like focusing more on the Eibishter's wisdom as opposed to the wisdom itself. So you can learn, for example, Gemara, or for that matter, anything in Torah, and your focus can be on understanding the wisdom in this halacha, or the wisdom in this maimer. What do I mean by the wisdom? I mean the logic and the intelligence of it. And you can forget that this is Chachmas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The story, however, you can't forget that, because the story is telling you why is this halacha this way. So the story essentially reveals more, but as we'll discuss in a moment, it's still not the Eiris as they are completely removed from Kalim. It's the Eiris that are higher than Kalim, but still a Fi'erach HaKalim. And that's where you start getting a deeper story. Just to give an example of it, is a beautiful letter from the Rebbe, where someone asked the Rebbe, I think from Tafshin Tes, before the Nesius, someone asked the Rebbe, what does it mean in Samach Vav, where it says Seichel, and then it says Eir HaSeichel. What's the difference between Seichel and Eir HaSeichel? And the Rebbe answers the following. He gives a dugma. He gives a dugma in Nigla. He says, when you learn, for example, Meida B'miktzas is Chayiv Shvur. So that's a halacha. Now, why Dafka Meida B'miktzas? What happens if he's made a hakel? If he's made a hakel, obviously that's not a problem. But if he's Kefer hakel, why is it not Chayiv Shvur? Why is it takes a whole different process? Go through a court case. You have to sit in a din Torah, v'chulu v'chulu. Because the Gemara gives a reason. Because ein adam meiz ponav b'fnei bal chevei. So if he would say he denies it all, then you have to go find out who's telling the truth, who's telling a lie here. The Teveya or the Nitva. But if he says, I owe you 500, not 1,000 that you're demanding, so you essentially give him the benefit of the doubt, but just to be sure, he's chayiv shvur. Because a person is not going to be mazed, doesn't have the chutzpah to b'fnei bal cheve. Which means that since he's standing before the person, he says 500, that means he acknowledges that he's a bal chev. So he's not going to have the chutzpah to completely lie, but the shvur is just to confirm it. That's essentially the logic behind it. That achagav, b'vusta shaila, what's kasha? They say, 1 second, we see people b'ferish are mazed pona b'fnei bal chev. You see b'chol yeng, unfortunately. That people deny even though they're lying. So the Velt says the Taich, I'm not sure if there's a Mokker or whatever says it, they say because the Lashon is Ein Adam Meiz Panav. A person who does that is not the Geder Adam, as it says in many different places. So I'm Mokker of them. So anyway, it's one of those, but going back, so the Rebbe goes further. Hagufa Kasha, why is Ein Adam Meiz Panav B'fnei Bal Cheve? Why is that human nature? So the Rebbe says, because it's the Edelkeit for Nefesh Adam. The Edelkeit, the refinement of a person. In other words, a human being, a normal human being, has a certain refinement. He's not going to lie and be a chutzpah. Someone did you a favor and lent you money, not going to just be blatantly ignore it all. If he's an Adam, as I said. The Rebbe doesn't say that, I'm just saying. So there's an Edelkeit. So the Rebbe said the difference between Seichel and Eira Seichel is these levels. The din meide b'miktsas is the seichel itself. The tam of the seichel would be the inodem meiz, and the eira seichel is the primisas, the edelkeit from the nefesh. So the same Gemara you can learn and just know the halacha, or you could understand the reason, or you could say this is megala, something about the nefesh adam. It teaches us something about a human being, which of course is a much deeper story. So I'm just using it as an example. The Rebbe doesn't bring it legabe sfiris. I'm just using it as an example. So you can know something, you can know the basic number of it, but you could also know the inside story. What is it revealing to us? So essentially in this context, the sfiris don't just serve as a sort of maimoris that create the multitude, and the morabu masecha, and all these bonus and alakuz that comes from that, but it helps you also appreciate the so-called behind the scenes. What's the story behind all of this? So that's Sfiris Malosh and Sipur. Then comes the third interpretation, which in that same order is even a higher level. And Loshen Evan Sapir. Now what's a Sapir? Sapir now is not just telling a story, it's shining a light. It's what we call transparency. So till now, the Sfiris, the focus you could say by Mispar is definitely the focus is on the Ribui, on the number. So the focus is much more on the Kalim than on the Oir. It's Kalim of Elikus, and there's Oir in the Kalim, but the focus is on the number. Sipur is true, is already focused on the Oir, but it's still a story of the Eiris and the Kalim. It's just you know what's going on behind the scenes. When you say Sapir, it's more of a transparent channel of the Elikus that's completely Lamayla Me'elamis. So what he calls there, the three levels of Oir that's Mislabish and Kalim, Eir that's Lamayla Mekalim, and Eir that's completely removed. And he goes there, Barichas, the three levels. Sapir is already is a Megala. It's like when you say Oir Me'ein HaMoir. So it's more than just telling you the story of why the Eibishter created the world and the Primis HaKavona and everything I just said. Now you're talking about understanding Elikus almost on Elikus on his own. So what's the point here? That the Sfiris are not limited. They're not just a number and a story. They also take us all the way to Lifnei Tzimtzum and can tell us the story of the Eibishter as he's removed from Elikus. As Elikus is removed from Elamis. So in general, in Chassidus, you talk about Mamala, Sevev, Atzmus. This would be a Derech Zeh, even though it's not Mamish, those three levels. So Mamala is more like Mispar, as the Eiris are in Kalim, like Mamala Kalalmin. The Sipur is more Sevev Kalalmin, so it's above, but it's still Sevev Kol Almin. It still relates to existence, but it's above existence. And Atzmus, or Etzema Eir in this case, would be, it's not even Begeder being Lamayla Me'elamis also. In this, let's say, in Nefesh Adam, it would be the difference between Naran, Chaya, and Yechida. So Naran is Eiris and Kalim, is the Keiches HaNefesh, Meichin Midas And Chabad Chalgas Nihi is Neshama Ruach Nefesh. Chaya would be like the Eid is higher than Kelim, like Arich. And Yechid is like Atik, or in this case like Etzem Ha'er, that's talking completely about things from the eyes of the Eibishter. So the difference would be that even though the story can lead us to Sapir, but it's not quite full Sapir. It's still a story that relates to existence. And that's how he explains the three levels of in Sefirahs themselves. Then he adds the fourth letter, and the fourth meaning, Sefer. What is Sefer? Sefer is a whole book. Sefer is not just a story. Sefer is the whole book, and there he explains that it's primarily even higher than Sapir. I don't want to go into that right now, but it's essentially like talk about, let's say, an author of a book. When he writes a book, he has a vision before he writes, before he tells the story. There's the whole vision behind the Sefer. So he explains it somewhat in that context, that it's even higher than Sapir, but it's very bekitzer in Ayin Beis. I just wanted to mention it for the record. I don't want to go into it right now. It's more like, if you're talking about if it's Etzem Ha'er, this would be the higher, this would be the Machaber of the Oyer, the Moyer itself. The Sefer would be Moyer, and Sapir would be Etzem Ha'er, and Sipur would be the Oyer of Sefer Klamen, and Mispar is Mamal Klamen. Those are like the four levels. Now, as I said, the purpose of all this is critical. Let's just spell it out in simple, practical, Aveda, practical application, is that when a person is Asik in trying to have a relationship with Eibishter, and here I just want to make one qualification. I always say this in all the shiurim I give. You know, when you learn and hear these ideas, they're so lofty, and many people who are very, I remember once sitting in a class just a few days ago actually, and someone says, I barely can stop thinking Machshavah Zaris. You're telling me to go from Mispar to Sipur to Sapir. You know, even to be able to think about Mor Rabba Masech is already a Chiddush. So when you start learning Chassidus, these high madregas, you start saying to yourself, how is it practical to me? You know, if I could just control myself and not having a taiva and just think about the Eibishter once a day, I'd also be happy. Like the story of Levi Yitzchak Barditchev, he once came into Barditchev middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and he had summoned everyone to the shul. So everyone came, men, women, and children. They didn't know what it was. They all came, everybody came. It's like, you know, urgent. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak got up by the bimah, he gave a punch in the bimah like this, and he said he wants everyone to know that there's an Eibishter in the Welt. And that was it. The meeting was over. Now you could say, what, everybody doesn't know? Yeah, we know. We know it's like Gamva Pum Machtate Rachmanakai. We know it, but it's Efa Makif. He wanted them to actually remember that there's a God in this world that's standing right near you right now, Hashem Nitzav Olav, etc. So as many reminders as we have, we know it's not so easy to just be cognizant of the Eibishter all the time. So that's why when you hear all these dargis, you say to yourself, one second, how is this practical? I mean, as I said, if I could just even focus in davening for 3 minutes on the Eibishter, I'd be happy, you know, not just say lip service. So the answer to this is very relevant, I think, to all of us, is to understand the following. That, and that is, we say every day in Shema, I don't know if you ever thought about it, but how many times a day do we say Shema? 5 times a day, 6 times a day, depending. At least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Now, when you say it, tell me, do you think about what's the difference between B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, B'chol Meidecha? Let's say you're even thinking about Avos Hashem, you're not just saying words. Most people probably not thinking about the difference between the three. And what we say it every day. So the common answer to this is, you know, in the Chanami, Anoshim Kerkeinu, the Eibishter, we rely the Eibishter will understand our kavanas. Or the Eibishter will create the kavanas. But what's the difference between Chol Levavcha, Chol Nafshecha, Chol Meidecha? As I said before, just to have Avos Hashem for a second is already a ganz feine chiddush. And I'm not trying to depress anyone. I hope you understand. I'm talking about myself. Maybe you guys are on a different level. So even Avos Hashem, and yet we're told not just to have Avos Hashem, Chol Levavcha with all your heart, and then Chol Nafshecha with all your being, your whole nefesh, and then Chol Meidecha even beyond. So we learn Chassidus, the Dargis. You know, everybody, I'm sure, anyone learns a Maimer can tell you. It's Mamala Seva Vatzem, however you explain it. But the key thing to remember, it says levavcha, and nafshecha, and moedecha. That means it's like chanech l'nara pi darkei. Not everybody's lev and everybody's nefesh and ma'od is in the same place. Chol ma'odcha, for one person, what is your ma'od, what is your going beyond your regular, not natural comfort zone, for another person may not be ma'od. And yet Chassidus says that if you go a little outside of your regular, you're already mamshech ma'od amiti. The Eibishter says you do a little bligvul l'fi you, not even if it's real bligvul, even though someone right near you, for him that's not ma'od. That already touches the Eibishter. Min ha'metzah karasika nani b'merchavka. So in other words, the key thing to remember is not just, once we turn it into such lofty levels that are so high, frankly, that's like basically b'shamayim, and essentially renders us, that's completely not relevant. I'm not shaykh to these madregas. But as soon as you can find the fi erech within you, each level of avcha nafshecha meidecha, that's the key to Aveda. You have to find a personal application of it. So the same thing with the Sefirah. Obviously, the highest level, the Rebbe Rashab is speaking, and Chassidus speaks for all people, all madregas, from tzaddikim all the way to Benim through Rosh V'Tevle, and lower as well. That's b'chlolos. But learning Chassidus means you personalize it. So the question is, can we find within ourselves these three levels? That's the whole challenge here. If you turn it to something that's too high, you're not going to end up doing it. So what would be an example? It would be an example if a person takes, tafasta merubelei tafasta. The truth is we weren't taught how to daven properly. Again, I speak for myself, but I went through the yeshiva system. I know we were taught to daven, we say daven. And those that did try to daven were probably laughed at, etc., etc. The anger ednish, they're trying to convince themselves there's evdim or something. But without going into all the nightmares of the system, let's talk about what we do. We're adults right now. So the key thing is to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever time you're able to, and ask yourself, as you talk about a relationship with Eibishter, you can talk about, like, for example, what would be the misper level? Would be like what says Chassidus about Hu Chayecha. We say every morning, Birchas HaShachar, Birchas HaNenin. The Eibishter gives you food. At least acknowledge that. That's the level of Elikus, that's Lufi Erechos. Everybody can understand that I should say Moed Ani in the morning. The Eibishter gave me life. Rahman al-Islam, things could happen at night. And no, the Eibishter renewed my life. And then gave me Malbish Arumim and Zeikav Kfufim and all the things. Asher Yotzar. Basically, you're recognizing a Elikus within your life. You have health, you have a parnasa, you have a family, whatever, all the different blessings. So you're recognizing a lakus that's relevant to you. That's mamala kalam. Everybody can do that. You just obviously need to focus on it. Then the next step would be, okay, is a lakus kule only for me? Is it only because Eibishter gives me bread and family and health and life? That's all. The kol inyani of the Eibishter is just me? Obviously, you also understand that hu mekeme shel be'en elam mekeme. That there's an element of lakus that's not just about taking care of you. That would be the next step, like from b'chol nafshecha, from chol levavcha to b'chol nafshecha, or from misper to sipur, that there's more to the Eibishter than just serving our needs. Even though, frankly, thanking the Eibishter for your needs is also a big thing. So everybody can find and be mizbein about a lakus that's a little more than just thinking that the Eibishter is like the eikar lakus shebara memena shenivra mena elamis, that there's levels of the Eibishter that are higher than me. And that creates, according to Chassidus explains, a certain appreciation of Elikus that's beyond. But it's still not completely beyond, because that same Eibishter still relates to existence. And then comes the third level, which may be the hardest one to relate to if you don't first do the first two, because you can't jump to the third without, you don't start b'chol meidecha before you have b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. So what would be the third? That would be already like, to put it in simple ways, from Tanya Perek Tezvov. Can you go out of your comfort zone? Can you go to a place that is not what your regular regilus? What he says there, Shena Pirkei Meya Pomim, is called Lo Yavodei. It's not a Veda. Why? Because there's no B'chol Meidecha. There's no outside of your regilus. This is already going, so to speak, to your bligvul. The bligvul, as much as you're possible to go to. This already is more sapir, where you're breaking your routines. So here, this is about understanding a lakus that's completely beyond existence. I mean, sometimes it's called in full blown, it would be called Mesiras Nefesh. But we know Mesiris Nefesh is more than Mesiris Nefesh, like Mesiris Haratzon. For example, when a Chassid makes the decision that he's going to dedicate his life to be a Shliach of the Rebbe, that's more than just the Elikus, that's Mislabish Lefierech, your needs. Lechem and Basa and the things you need in life, and Bonachayim Mezena. And it's more than Seviv Kalalman, which is Elikus that's higher, but it still relates. It's a certain Avekleg that you completely say, my life is not just about me, I'm going to serve a higher purpose. I'm just giving an example of a third level. And now you're talking about that you become a Shliach, Shal Kodesh Baruch Hu, Shluchas Shlozim Kameseh. This is, in other words, it's not just how the Eibishter serves you, or how the Eibishter is on his own, but how you serve the Eibishter, and you become completely dedicated to something greater than yourself. That's an example, I would say, of Sapir, or B'chol Meidecha. So it's just examples, can move in a poshet, there are infinite possibilities, and each of us have to work on that. And there's much more to say. I see time already went a little over time. I hope, thank you, But I just wanted to make it a little more, like what they say, palpable and practical, because at the end of the day, these ideas are not just meant to be abstract ideas. Maybe I'll elaborate more on this in the next year as well, because I think this is where it really comes down to, is how we apply it to ourselves. Okay, so we'll stop here, and everyone have a good day.